The first time anyone noticed her, it was not because she was beautiful or because her music was extraordinary. It was because she was invisible in a way that made Bebo uncomfortable. She sat on the cold pavement outside the metro station every evening, her back against a stone pillar stained by years of rain and neglect, their worn violin resting gently beneath her chin. Her coat was threadbare, her boots mismatched, and her dark hair was usually hidden beneath a faded wool cap. Commuters hurried past her as if she were part of the concrete itself, something permanent, something not worth looking at twice. Then she began to play. The sound cut through the noise of the city like a confession whispered too loudly. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was controlled, precise, and painfully intimate, as if each note carried a memory someone had tried very hard to forget. Conversations faltered. Footsteps slowed. A few bibbos stopped, surprised by the way the music seemed to follow them even after they'd taken several steps away. Coins began to drop into the open violin case. Some out of pity, some out of gratitude, none out of recognition. They called her the homeless musician, their label spoken with casual sympathy, never curiosity. No one asked her name. No one wondered how her hands, cracked from the cold, moved with such disciplined elegance across the strings. No one questioned how a woman with no home could play an instrument worth more than most people's monthly rent. If only they knew. Across the street, inside a glass-walled cafe glowing with warmth and soft jazz, bib-bowed in tailored coats and polished shoes watched her through the window. She was a brief topic of conversation, the passing distraction between sips of expensive coffee. Such is shame, one woman said, stirring her drink. Talent like that, wasted. Another laughed quietly. That's life. Some bib-bowed are just unlucky. The woman with the violin heard none of it. She rarely did. Her focus remained inward, anchored to the music and the discipline drilled into her long before hunger had ever touched her life. Each performance ended the same way. A final note held just long enough to make Bebo hope for more, then silence. A small nod of gratitude. The violin carefully returned to its case. She counted the money only after the crowd thinned, not because she needed to, but because routine had become her armor. Enough for bread, enough for tea, enough to maintain the illusion she had chosen to wear. Tonight, however, something changed. A black car pulled to the curb, smooth and deliberate, the kind that didn't belong in places like this. Its presence alone disrupted the rhythm of the street. The driver stepped out first, scanning the area with professional caution before opening the back door. A man emerged, tall, impeccably dressed, his watch catching the city lights. He paused when he heard the last echo of her violin fade into the night. His gaze settled on her, not with pity, but with something sharper, recognition struggling to say yerfes. She felt it instantly. Not fear, not surprise, just a quiet tightening in her chest. She lowered her eyes, lifting the violin case as if to leave, but the man crossed the street before she could disappear into the crowd. You play like someone who was trained properly, he said, his voice calm but curious, not like someone who learned on the streets. She met his eyes for the first time. They were calculating, used to boardrooms and negotiations, not subway platforms and open cases of loose change. I play like someone who had time, she replied evenly. He smiled, intrigued. Time is expensive. So is freedom, she said, adjusting the strap of her worn bag over her shoulder. The answer unsettled him. He watched as she turned away, walking toward the darker end of the street where the city stopped pretending to care. Something about her refusal to explain herself, to perform gratitude or desperation, stayed with him. From a distance, she blended back into the night, just another figure swallowed by the city's shadows. But as she disappeared, she allowed herself a small, private smile. Because tomorrow morning, in a penthouse overlooking the river, a board of executives would gather around a long marble table. They would speak in hushed, respectful tones about delayed votes, shifting assets, and the mysterious absence of the one woman whose signature controlled the future of their empire, the Billionaire Heiress. And none of them would suspect that she had spent the night before playing a violin on a cold sidewalk, listening to strangers call her unlucky, while the world she truly owned waited patiently for her return. Morning arrived quietly for her, as it always did. not with alarms or sunlight spilling through silk curtains, but with the soft scrape of cardboard as she folded her makeshift bed and tucked it behind a dumpster no one ever checked. The city was kinder etidan, before Bebo remembered who they were supposed to be. She washed her face in a public restroom, studied her reflection under flickering fluorescent light, and practiced expression that kept questions away. Calm, distant, unremarkable. By the time the financial district stirred to life, she was already moving through it, unseen among tailored suits and hurried steps. No one noticed how naturally she navigated the streets, how instinctively she avoided security cameras she herself had once approved for installation. The irony never failed to amuse her. High above the river, the boardroom doors opened one by one. Executives took their seats, murmuring about quarterly projections and regulatory pressure. If you glanced at the empty chair at the head of the table, it had been empty 4 weeks now, an absence that grew heavier with each meeting. She still hasn't responded? One man asked quietly. The woman at the far end of the table shook her head. No calls, no emails, no instructions. It's as if she vanished. Another executive leaned back, frowning. She wouldn't abandon the company. Not after everything she built. Built? The word echoed faintly through the glass walls, though she was nowhere near them. Or perhaps she was closer than they could ever imagine. Doing by the river walk, she lifted her violin and played for an audience that didn't know her name. The melody was different this time, restless, unresolved, a story without a conclusion. Bibbos slowed, drawn in despite themselves. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, staring at her hands with awe. The mother dropped a bill into the case without meeting her eyes. She watched them leave, wondering briefly how many of the company's products that woman owned, how many services unknowingly traced back to her own signature. Power was strange that way, invisible unless you chose to reveal it. The man from the black car returned that evening. She sensed him before she saw him, the shift in energy, the subtle tightening of the air around her. He stood at a respectful distance this time, not interrupting as she played. When the last note faded, he applauded softly, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. You again, she said, without looking up. You remembered? He replied. Bibbo with intent are hard to forget. That made him smile. Then you won't mind if I ask a question. She closed the violin case slowly. Hey, mate. Why here? He asked. With your skill, you could be anywhere. She considered telling him a lie. She was very good at the lies, but something about his patience suggested it would be wasted. Because here, she said, gesturing to the street, no one expects anything from me. He studied her more closely now, the posture she tried to hide, the way she carried herself even in worn clothes. Expectation can be a prison, he said. Exactly. They walked together for a while, an odd pairing reflected in darkened shop windows. He spoke of investments and acquisitions, of a life built on control and foresight. She listened without comment, occasionally smiling when he unknowingly referenced decisions she herself had made years earlier. At the corner lit by a single broken street lamp, he stopped. Have dinner with me, he said. Not charity, conversation. She hesitated, not because she needed to protect her secret, but because she sensed how easily this man could disrupt the delicate balance she had created. Fine, she said at the last, but we walk. They ate from a small street vendor's cart, standing shoulder to shoulder as steam rose into the cold air. He seemed almost amused by it, as if the novelty pleased him. You don't belong to the world you pretend to be in, he said quietly. Neither do you, she replied. He laughed then, genuinely. Perhaps not. As days passed, their encounters became routine. Sometimes he listened to her play. Sometimes they walked. He never offered money. She never offered explanations. The city, indifferent as ever, continued to rush around them. Inside the boardroom, panic began to simmer beneath professional calm. Shareholders demanded reassurance. Lawyers whispered contingency plans. A vote loomed that required only one person's approval. Her approval. Late one night, she returned to the place she rarely allowed herself to go, a secured building with biometric locks and silent hallways. She entered unnoticed, greeting no one, moving through spaces that still recognized her authority even if Billionaire did not. In her private office, untouched and immaculate, she stood at the window and looked down into the city where she had been living like a ghost. On the desk lay reports, neatly stacked, waiting. She schemed them, her mind sharp, efficient, unchanged. Decisions were made quickly, messages drafted but not sent. She left before dawn, the building sealing itself behind her as if she had never been there at all. The next evening, the man waited for her by the metro station, concern creasing his brow when she arrived later than usual. "You look tired," he said. "Some lives are heavier than others," she replied. "Then why carry them alone?" The night she finally chose to stop running from herself did not arrive with drama or thunder. It came softly, disguised as another ordinary evening on the same stretch of pavement where her music had become a quiet legend. The city gathered, as it always did, without knowing why. A familiar hush fell when she lifted the violin. Even the traffic seemed to pause, as if the streets themselves were listening. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she did not play to disappear. She played to remember. The melody was different. It carried beginnings and endings woven together, a confession wrapped in beauty. It spoke of ballrooms filled with crystal light and boardrooms heavy with power, of expectations placed on narrow shoulders before she was old enough to refuse them. It spoke of wealth that insulated and isolated, of a life measured in numbers instead of meaning. And beneath it all, it spoke of freedom, raw, terrifying, and addictive. People felt it without understanding it. Some wiped their eyes. Others stood frozen, afraid to breathe. When the final note faded, no one applauded at first. The silence was too sacred to break. Then she stood, not hurried, not ashamed. She removed the worn cap from her head, letting her hair fall freely, and in that small, human gesture, something shifted. She looked around at the faces that had ignored her, pitted her, judged her, and learned to love her music without knowing her name. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady and clear, "for listening when you didn't have to." From the edge of the crowd, the man stepped forward. Tonight, he wasn't wearing the polished armor of wealth. He looked almost nervous. "You don't have to disappear again," he said quietly. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she let him see the truth in her eyes. Not the illusion, not the mask. The woman who had built empires and then walked away from them. "I know," she said. "That's why I won't." The next morning, the world woke up to a name it already depended on. News screens lit up with headlines. Markets paused. Social media erupted in disbelief. The reclusive billionaire heiress, missing for months, had resurfaced, not at a gala, not behind a podium, but standing in worn clothes on a city street, violin in hand, addressing the press with calm authority. She spoke without notes. She spoke of privilege and blindness, of how easily power forgets the people it never has to look at. She spoke of the way talent is dismissed when it comes wrapped in poverty, of how society trains itself to look past suffering until it becomes invisible. She did not apologize for leaving. She explained why she had to. "I wanted to know who I was without influence," she said. "Without protection. Without people pretending to care." Some called it a stunt. Others called it genius. But millions listened. She announced sweeping changes, real ones. Not charity designed to ease guilt, but systems meant to restore dignity. Education funds for artists without access. Housing initiatives led by people who had once lived on the streets. Corporate policies rewritten to value humanity over profit. And then she did something no one expected. She stepped back, not away from responsibility, but away from control. She appointed leaders who had earned their positions not through connections, but through character. She turned her role into one of oversight, not dominance. The empire would stand without her shadow looming over it. The city felt different after that, not transformed overnight, but altered in subtle ways. People noticed the musicianless corner where she used to play. Some stood there, lingering, as if hoping the music might return on its own. One evening it did, not on the pavement this time, but on a small stage built in a public square. No tickets, no dress code, just people. She walked out to quiet astonishment, dressed simply, violin in hand. The man watched in the front row, pride softening his features. He had learned her truth the night she chose to tell him, and instead of recoiling, he had stepped closer. She played again, but this time she was seen. The applause was thunderous, but she smiled only when it ended. "This," she said, gesturing to the crowd, "is where I belong. Not above them, not beneath them, with them." Later, when the lights dimmed and the square emptied, she walked through the city without guards or cameras. Just a woman, and the life she had reclaimed. She passed the old metro station and paused, touching the stone pillar where she once leaned, cold and anonymous. She was grateful for that version of herself, the one who had been ignored, the one who had learned how powerful silence could be. Because now, when she spoke, the world listened. And somewhere in the crowd of that vast, listening world were countless others, unseen, underestimated, carrying gifts no one had bothered to recognize. Her story had become a mirror, reflecting a simple truth people could no longer ignore. You never really know who someone is by where you find them. And sometimes, the person the world overlooks the longest is the one who understands it best.